Hello everyone, my name is Galbraith, and in today's video I'm going to be telling you all about the wonderful world of critical thinking. So, you might be asking yourself, what exactly is critical thinking? Well, luckily I have this handy dandy iPad here with one of my favorite definitions. And yes, it's my favorite just because it's extremely long and has big words. It says, critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. But if that's a little too much for you to comprehend and you got lost in those beautiful words, the basic definition of critical thinking is the analysis of facts to form a judgment. So the person who first coined the phrase critical thinking was a philosopher known as John Dewey. You might have heard his name a couple of times before, either in management or marketing classes, or even just philosophy and psychology classes. We can really credit Dewey for a lot of the restructuring of the US educational system that we saw in the early half of the 20th century. So although this is the first time critical thinking as we know it now was coined, critical thinking goes back over 2,500 years to the days of Socrates. So critical thinking is an important part of really any person's life. Critical thinking doesn't just have to be applied to those big picture problems and decisions that we sometimes have to make. It can really be applied to any decision we might have to make in our life, whether it's, what outfit to wear or where to go to eat for dinner. It's really important to just be able to understand the basics of critical thinking and really what goes into it. So now that you have a little bit of context about the history of critical thinking, let's jump into some of the steps that go into the critical thinking process. So there are really 5 steps that go into the critical thinking process. The first is pretty obvious, but that is to identify the problem. This goes back to the simple ideology that you can't solve a problem that you don't know you have. Once you identify the problem, you really need to analyze the problem. This really requires you to look at the problem from a variety of different perspectives. Is the problem solvable? Is it real or just perceived? The next step then would be to brainstorm possible solutions to this problem. In this step, it's really important to come up with several different solutions. That's kind of the idea of brainstorming. You're not just coming up with one idea, you're really just spewing thoughts and just coming up with as many things as you possibly can think of. The fourth step is to kind of decide which of these solutions is the best to proceed with and move forward in order to solve the problem with. And finally, take action. Implement this solution. Each of these steps is pretty straightforward and self-explanatory, and it really goes back to the roots that critical thinking isn't hard. It's just remembering the actual process of it and going through the steps. If you do that, you will be successful at critical thinking. It's really not anything too challenging, but in the long run, it certainly does pay its dividends. As I mentioned before, you're not just going to be using critical thinking in your professional career moving forward upon graduation. You can use it in your everyday life as a student, as a family member, really in any situation where you have to make a decision. The ability to practice critical thinking will make your life better. So one common perception is that critical thinking skills are the same as normal problem-solving skills, but this isn't exactly true. Critical thinking skills certainly are fundamental to those problem-solving skills, but there are other skills that help us solve problems that aren't necessarily critical thinking skills. So some of these problem-solving skills that are actually not critical thinking skills include emotional intelligence, as well as skills of persuasion and oration. One other example that I kind of like to think of that differentiates problem-solving skills with critical thinking skills is solving a linear equation or any other, math problem. When you are presented with a math problem, it is a very straightforward path that you need to follow in order to solve that problem. Sure, there might be different ways that you can go about to get to that same answer, but in order to get there, it doesn't really require you to think way outside the box and collect tons of information and thoughts and perspectives. You really know how to do something, and once you know how to do it, you're able to get it done. With calculus, things are definitely very formulaic. You follow the same steps each time with certain variations, and you will get to the final result every time. But critical thinking isn't necessarily the same. Critical thinking involves a lot more collecting information, but in addition to just collecting that information, it is really important that you are able to organize that information in your head. Then from there, you can analyze and evaluate the information that you already have. Finally, the thing that kind of differentiates critical thinking the most is that you must be able to kind of make connections between all these different sets of information that you have organized in your head. And probably one of the most important things with critical thinking is just remembering what actually is relevant. When critical thinking, it's easy to just have so much information coming in, but it's important to remember what actually matters. One easy example to illustrate of when you might really need to use all the different steps of critical thinking during your college career is if you're going for an internship and they require some sort of case study. I myself personally had to participate in a case study a couple of weeks ago for a final round interview for a banking internship. Thankfully, I had actually undergone certain other case studies thus far in my college career, so I felt somewhat prepared. But it is definitely a somewhat daunting process. But as long as you understand the different principles of critical thinking, it is definitely something that should not be too intimidating. The point of these case studies during these interviews isn't necessarily to see you find the perfect solution. It's more so to just judge your critical thinking skills and your ability to solve problems. Not only are case studies involved in internship applications, but I actually went through some case studies for some certain organizations here, even at Heavener School of Business. The employers or the organization conducting the case study, they really want to see the way that you think. They want to see how you communicate with the team, the different steps you go through in order to solve a problem. So because of this, it's not necessarily about that final solution that you find, it's about the journey that you went on in order to find that. It really goes back to those critical thinking steps of identifying the problem, analyzing the different solutions, and then really deciding which was the best to go from there. So now you might be wondering, what are some different ways that you can go about to develop these critical thinking skills? So the first would just be to expand your industry-specific or technical skills, just so that then you can be better able to understand and identify problems when they arise. Now, a more obvious route would be to take additional courses, whether they are actually offered by your school or offered on YouTube or any of the other kind of course websites that the internet has to offer. Another one of my favorites is actually to seek advice from professionals in the career or industry that you want to pursue. If you reach out to them in a good manner, they're more than likely willing to help you, especially if you're kind of asking the right questions and asking good questions that, require them to think, and they're not just typical questions that anyone looking for an interview would ask. Another easy thing is to just practice brainstorming activities. It's important to get your mind used to coming up with a lot of different solutions for problems. Some other more fun ideas to develop these skills are to approach every day with that what-if mentality. This requires you to think through your day with a lot of different perspectives of how your day could go. Another thing is to keep an idea journal. This kind of goes back to that brainstorming and just coming up with as many different ideas and solutions that you can. And finally, the last one, play solo games online. There are so many websites available for you to develop these skills and really work on your analysis and every other skill that kind of goes into critical thinking. So this was my basic rundown of critical thinking. In case it got lost in translation these last couple of minutes, just remember, critical thinking is the analysis of facts to form a judgment. Just remember to gather as many facts as possible before making a judgment. If you do that, you will be able to make a somewhat informed decision. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about this process and that you can see all of the benefits that it can provide for your life. If you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out, and I will see you in the next one.